Welcome to this Java Break with Basis. The topic for this session is why browsers matter with BUI. We'll be talking about and exploring more information about Basis's new browser user interface. I'm Nico Spence, Chairman and CEO of Basis International, and today I'll be joined by Nick Decker, our engineering supervisor, who will assist me in demonstrating some of the new features and functions that you can add to your Basis application by virtue of the ability to deploy your application in a browser user interface. So let's have a look at the agenda of today's session. Firstly, we'll recap what BUI is all about, describe what BUI is. Then we'll talk about the Basis application client choices that you have and show you where BUI fits into that set of choices. And then we'll talk about how you can prepare and configure your application for the browser user interface. What's the magic required to get from where you currently are to the browser user interface? We'll have a look at the meat of today's session, talking about why browsers matter, tell you about the differences in look and feel and show some examples thereof, and also talk about performance. It's often very near and dear to all of our hearts, about how well our application performs, and tell you what makes a difference between various browsers and the performance that you can expect therefrom. Then we'll talk about making your BUI application look good, how you can present it, what some of your choices are to provide the vehicle to present your BUI application. And then we'll summarize our session today. So let's first talk about the browser user interface. A recap is that it's the thinnest of thin clients. Any of your existing GUI applications should be able to run in the browser user interface with minor or no code changes. The key benefits are that you need no JVM, no Java virtual machine is needed on the client device. So be it a desktop computer or a handheld device like a smartphone or like an iPhone, there's no need for a JVM to be running on that device to be able to deploy your application on that device. So that also means that there's no interpreter running on that client. Everything's running at the server level and is only the face of the application that is then deployed on the client device. So let's recap on what those Basis application clients are. What are the clients that are available to you right now? If you're running in a character user environment, you can look at terminals, green screen terminals, traditional ones, or terminal emulation programs that may run on a Windows PC or any other device. So thin clients, you could have the BBJ thin client or third-party thin client like Windows Terminal Server. In the GUI environment, in the graphical user interface, you could have a fat client Visual Pro 5 or BBJ as a fat client, or you could have BBJ's thin client, or some third-party thin client, again like Windows Terminal Services or Citrix. Now we've added a new function, a new opportunity, a new deployment choice for you that you can deploy in a browser user interface, and the browser becomes the client. Think of it as a separate machine. And that really gives us the thinnest of thin clients, a wafer thin client BBJ. So what applications can you run? They need to be GUI, so GUI BBJ applications will run in the browser user interface. What does that mean? You can take a Visual Pro 5 application, convert it to BBJ. Those steps are fairly simple and straightforward. I'd like to refer you to some of our previous Java breaks where we touched on the simple steps required to move from Pro 5 or Visual Pro 5 to BBJ. You could be running app builder applications, and they could have been based on the forerunner of App Builder, which is GUI Builder. You could have written them as Barista applications using Basis's advanced application development framework built on a data dictionary to create your GUI applications. And that's also a great way to move an existing character-based application to GUI. Or it could be a hand-coded GUI application, mnemonics to control the screen layout, or using the ASCII resources for your screen design that might have been generated by a form builder, and that would be the basis of your application. So what are the steps? You've got your application, it's a GUI application. You've either converted a Visual Pro 5 app to GUI, or you've got an existing BBJ GUI app, or you've got an application that you've taken with Barista and you've made it GUI. So how do you prepare and configure that for BUI? Well, the first thing you need to do is to refer to the BBJ BUI Getting Started document. That's the document wherein we describe how you can get started. We'd also describe the functionality that is not yet available in BUI that may be available in the BBJ thin client. So have a look at that. You can go to that from our BBJ download page. We've highlighted that at the top of this screenshot. And then down below you'll see BBJ BUI getting started. So that's a living and breathing document we update as we add new feature and functionality to the BUI environment. So what's your next step? You need to register your application in Enterprise Manager's BUI configuration panel. And then you need to copy the URL and test your application in a web browser. As simple as that. So let's have a look at some of that in action. I'm going to hand over to Nick Decker, who's going to take you through an example of how we can set up and configure one of your existing GUI applications to be able to run in the browser user interface.
So you have a BBJ application that you've written and you want to publish it in BUI so that your customers can run it in a web browser. What are the steps to do that? Well, the first thing that you'll want to do is go to the BBJ download page. There's a link there entitled BBJ BUI Getting Started. This is a document that covers every aspect of BUI. How to select your app, publish your app, test your app, and so on and so forth. Of primary importance, though, are the controls that are implemented and the controls that are not yet implemented. For example, when I click on the What's Not Yet Implemented, I get a list of all of the controls and things like drag and drop and the help mnemonic that aren't implemented yet. If your application relies on these, then it won't work quite yet in BUI until we implement those. However, if you scroll up, there are a number of controls that we have implemented in BUI. So after checking to make sure that your application is supported, the next thing to do is take it out for a test spin. So what we'll do is we'll run Enterprise Manager and click on the BUI configuration tab. From there, we'll say that we want to create a new application. By default, it's entitled New, and we'll change that to Invoice. And now we have to select the parameters for the program. So the first step is showing where the program resides. In this case, it's under Demos, Print Invoice, and it's the invoice.bbj program, so we'll select that. The next parameter is the BBJ configuration file. So in our case, we'll just go to the config directory and select the config.bbx file. Then we have the working directory for the demo, and in most cases that's probably going to be the same directory as your program. So we'll go to Basis, Demos, and we'll select the print invoice directory. After that, we can set up a terminal, and in our case we're going to use a special mini terminal, which is a special HTML-based console that is viewable in the web browser, and it will allow us to debug our application. So once that's done, I can click on the Save icon, and then at that point I can test it. In the URL text box, if I right-click, I have the option to either copy that URL so I can send it off to a customer in an email perhaps, or I can select Launch. And when I do that, it will bring it up in my web browser. So this is a good way to test your application and make sure that it works well in BUI. In our case, I've got a navigator that as I scroll through will go through all of my customers. And after I've selected a customer, then I can click on Preview Invoice. And as you can see, my print preview showed up with my invoice as a PDF. So it looks like my application is fully functional and it's ready to be tested by customers. So in this case now I can go back to Enterprise Manager, copy that URL into my clipboard, and then go and email my customers and send them the link.
Thank you, Nick. That gives us a good idea of how easily we go in and get started with our BUI application. So let's have a look at a recap of the BUI versus BBJ thin client environment. What's different between the two? What are the benefits? Well, firstly, there's no need to install a JVM on the client again, as I said earlier. There's no need to check to see if the jars have been updated. You don't need to wait for any jars to download to the client. We don't have to deal with any issues like clearing the client's jar cache if anything goes wrong. And there's no need to sign and list jars to deploy. Everything's running off the server. So all you need is a browser on the client device, be that client device a PC, a notebook, a netbook, or a smartphone type mobile device. So let's talk about why browsers matter. Of course, there are fundamental differences between browsers. Browsers use different layout engines that are responsible for rendering the page, which will be based upon the HTML, the cascading style sheets, the CSS, or the images that are provided by the web server. Some browsers share the same engine. In other words, Chrome and Safari, for example, use WebKit. And of course, that'll simplify our testing. But the answer, of course, is to make sure that your application looks elegant and sufficiently attractive on all of the available browsers that your customers may be deploying your application on. Let's have a look at some of the fundamental differences. Let's look at the look and feel examples. BUI programs look and feel differently in different browsers. So here's an example of what a little customer maintenance application would look like if it's rendered in the Chrome browser. That same application running on an iPhone would look remarkably different when we look at the drop-down box for salesperson code. Let me hand over to Nick to give you some other examples of the differences on look and feel between various browsers.
Let's take a look at our customer maintenance application running in BUI on a couple of different browsers, just to point out how the browser, when it runs on different operating systems and as the browser varies, can change the look and feel slightly of your BUI application. So we'll start off by looking at our customer maintenance program in Firefox. The customer maintenance program uses a status bar, and on the bottom right-hand panel it indicates the environment or the browser in which it's running. So in this case you can see that we're running in Firefox and we're running on a Mac, and that's why the checkbox and the radio buttons have the gel aqua look and feel. However, it's still using some native HTML controls, as in the case of our drop-down list box. And that's one of the reasons that the drop-down box on the right-hand side looks a little bit more like a Windows 95 computer rather than a Mac. Also notice when we drop down the box, it literally drops down a list box and allows us to select one of the options. So now let's compare that to a different browser. This time we're running the customer maintenance program on Safari, and as you can see, a lot of our controls look similar, such as our checkbox and radio buttons. But this time our drop-down list box looks a little bit different. It looks a lot more like a native Mac application. So on the right-hand side for our list box, you can see that the button looks different because it has an up arrow and a down arrow. And when I click it, instead of dropping down a list box, it pops up a multi-selection box that allows me to choose one of the options. Now let's compare that to mobile Safari. Mobile Safari is the exact same thing as Safari, although it's a scaled down version that's meant for its mobile devices such as an iPhone or an iPod Touch. So in this case, our checkboxes and our radio buttons look a little bit different, and in fact our list box looks significantly different with the drop down on the right hand side. Since we're running in an iPhone, the controls are going to be different as well, and it utilizes native controls. So when we select this, for example, it brings up the native picker control on the iPhone that allows us to select one of the options and dismiss it like that. So that's a quick example of how your application might run and look a little bit differently on different operating systems and different browsers.
The most important thing for an application, other than its look and feel in the GUI world, is its performance. And so browsers matter when it comes to performance. Browsers will vary with their JavaScript performance, and in our case, our browser user interface environment is built upon the Google Web Toolkit, which renders the code into JavaScript. So the performance of the JavaScript is critical to the performance of the application in the browser. And JavaScript performance has a dramatic impact on the speed and the responsiveness of the BUI application. So let's look at the various browsers and talk about their performance. Firstly, the most widely used, the most popular browser is far and away Internet Explorer. Next best is Firefox, with Chrome, Safari, Opera, and others coming behind. This is an example of a recent statistic running through to July of 2010. So, unfortunately, Internet Explorer is also the one that runs JavaScript the most slowly of current versions of Internet Explorer. Chrome is your fastest, with Opera a close second. Safari is no slouch itself, and nor is Firefox. but as you can see from this chart, Internet Explorer performs very poorly. So what is our solution? Well, the good news is that Google offers Chrome Frame, which is a free open source plugin for Internet Explorer. It uses Google's JavaScript and HTML rendering engines within Internet Explorer. The scripts execute much more quickly, pages are rendered more correctly, and there's support for the latest standards, HTML5 and CSS3. And that, of course, means that it supports the browser user interface applications that you will generate from your Visual Pro 5 or BBJ GUI applications. BUI will automatically detect the Chrome frame within the Internet Explorer and then run much faster when it's available. So if you want to get hold of the Chrome frame, it's available from the Google website, and you can download that and install it with Internet Explorer 6, 7, or 8 on your Windows 7, Vista, or XP client box. So let's move on to the last part of our session today. I want to talk about how do you make your BUI applications look good within the browser or within the website that you're going to offer it up from. You can insert your new BUI application into any new or existing web page. You can use an HTML iframe to embed it into other pages on other servers. You can also integrate it into handwritten web pages, onto free Google websites, or within any popular content management system, CMS system. So let's look at some examples of making your BUI app look good. Here's an example of BUI in a handwritten web page. And let me hand over to Nick to show you some of these examples in action.
So now that you have your BUI application up and running in a browser, the next question is, how do you embed it into an existing website? Well, you can do this pretty easily with an HTML element called an iframe, or an inline frame. The inline frame is just a couple of tags, and within that you give the URL for your published BUI app. You also have control over the width and the height, and essentially what it does is it creates a small area, or a large area depending on your parameters, on the page of an existing website, and it puts the content of the URL that you provide inside that area box. So all you have to do is put in an iframe element into an existing web page and put in the URL that Enterprise Manager gives you for your BUI application, and your BUI application will load and show up in that page. So we've got a couple of examples for that. The first one is poweredbybbj.com. When I click on poweredbybbj.com, it takes us to the main screen, and as you can see, the BUI BCommerce application has begun to load and shows its splash screen. This is an example of a site that's written by hand, where it was optimized for speed and all of the HTML was written in an editor. All we had to do was insert a couple of lines for the iframe and we're good to go. We've got our BUI BCommerce application running in the middle of our website. The second example makes use of Google's free sites called Google Sites. So selecting this goes to sites.google.com and it loads the same application. Google Sites are free and it's pretty easy to create a corporate intranet based on Google Sites. And as we've seen, it's pretty easy to integrate your BUI application into your site. The third example demonstrates integrating a BUI application into a content management system. In this case, we're using Joomla, which is one of the more popular CMSs. And now the BCommerce application is loaded inside the Joomla CMS. So with just a couple of lines of HTML code, you can integrate your BUI application into any existing web page.
So to wrap up today's session, the really exciting part about BUI is that you can use BBJ to create your application for the web and then deploy it through BUI. So writing BBJ is certainly much easier than writing a web page. You can access any basis or third-party relational database management system data as you would usually do with your BBJ tools. You can utilize data-bound controls to make filling out forms a snap. You can do easy and flexible validation without having to write client-side JavaScript. And you can do all of this within your familiar language with the extensive syntax that allows you to also incorporate Java code. You have far better error handling than might have been available with any kind of a web development tool set. You have your standard bulletproof business basic code error handling capability. And you can leverage any existing code and libraries that you may have. In summary, it's Ajax without the pain. So let's summarize what we've covered today. We briefly looked at the recap of what BUI is all about, what it represents for our Business Basic community. We spoke about the various basis application clients and discussed where BUI fits in. We gave you examples of how you could very quickly prepare and configure your GUI application for deployment in the browser user interface and set it up in Enterprise Manager and test it. We spoke about why your choice of browser matters and also how you could go about improving your performance, how you could be aware of what the look and feel would be for your application under various browser interfaces. And then we touched on the final pieces of how you could make your BUI application look good within those various environments, utilizing perhaps a third-party CMS product, so show you how you could deploy it there, how you could deploy it within a frame on an existing web page. Before we go on to your questions, I want to remind you that our next Java break will be on September the 8th, and our topic for that day will be basis licensing frequently asked questions, in which we'll touch on how you can use licensing on your virtual machines, what we refer to as virtual licensing, and some of the other enhancements and benefits we've brought about to the whole licensing environment, including answering some of your most frequently asked questions. But let's get back to your questions.